Welcome to the next project. This is episode 12 of the Harley Benton SC Guitar Kit Modification Project series. If you watched the Trainwreck episode, you'll know that I had to take a couple steps back and redo a bunch of work that we'd already covered earlier in the project. And everything has gone well up to this point. In fact, I have the replacement binding back on. I used my router binding contraption and got the channel recut and new binding put in, and it went very well. It went better this time than the first time, so practice, I won't say makes perfect, but it's pointing me in the right direction. Anyway, moving along, in this episode I'm going to cut an F-hole and also put the control holes in the body. And I've done a bunch of sketching and came up with this shape for an F-hole, which will go, I think you can see I have it sketched on there. And then I don't know if you can see, yep, I got little marks there where I'm putting 2 volumes and a tone control pots on here. Also punch a new hole for the 3-way selector switch. So let's start the next project. Recovering from the Trainwreck incident, I knew I had a 628mm scale length and an intonation range of 627 to roughly 636. The bridge I'm using has roughly a 14mm intonation range, so I came up with a ballpark post placement of 629mm. And due to the adjustment of the bridge, I have a little bit of leeway fore and aft, so that works out pretty well. So I went ahead and committed once again to placing the post holes. And with a little bit of luck, I measured correctly this time. I pressed the post bushings into the body, and at the time I couldn't find my ground wire. So I went ahead and routed the first cavity and then found the wire and went ahead at that point, placed the wire and pressed in the second post bushing. Followed that up by testing for continuity, make sure that the ground wire didn't get severed when I pressed the bushing in. Everything worked out good. With the cavities all in place, it was time to start thinking about the F-hole. And this is something I've been sketching ideas on for about as long as this project has been going on. I've probably got 50 to 100 different pencil sketches of F-hole, sound holes, whatever. And then I went to the computer and did a whole bunch more, and this is just a small sampling. And after spending a bunch of time on it, I just tried to simplify and came up with something that looks like this. One nice thing about having a scale drawing of the guitar body on the computer, I was able to pretty well fine-tune where like the F-hole would go and where the volume tone controls would go. And actually here I'm testing to see if the F-hole would interfere with my arm while playing. And I still have the luxury of being able to move this little paper template around to fine-tune where I think it looks best. With a scale drawing in hand, I use a pretty low-tech way of transferring my computer drawing right to the body. Basically just poke holes through the printout and use a regular pencil to mark it. This is a countersinking bit, and I'm just using it to take the rough wood burrs off the back side of the body.
Not really necessary. A little sandpaper could do about the same thing, but this is just fun. For the F-hole, I had thought about making a template and doing some routing to cut the F-hole in, and you know, I'm kind of big on templates, it seems like. And then I decided, you know, I'm just going to use a coping saw and drill some pilot holes, thread the saw blade through, and do it the old school way. With the pilot or access holes drilled in the body, I just thread the blade of the coping saw through the holes, and in high-speed action, just start cutting away. I checked the footage when I was all done with this. It took me an hour and a half total to cut the F-hole out and bind it. So it didn't seem like it took that long, but it was an hour and a half total from when I drilled the holes for the F-hole, and did the sawing, did some cleanup work, which you'll see here in just a little bit, and then also glued the binding in. So an hour and a half to get one F-hole done. And this is a pretty simple F-hole. To do the cleanup of the hole, I used a number of different little files. I used a flat, I think it's called bastard file. I used a half round file. I used a rat tail file. And I used some kind of a wood rasp. In all, it went pretty well. My cuts weren't perfectly smooth, but they were not terribly jagged either, so it cleaned up pretty quick. Also used an X-Acto here with, I think it's a number 17 blade. It's like a kind of a chiseled blade. And I used that to get into that very tight little corner, which I was really expecting to be a problem for binding. But I did do a pretty simple binding job on this, so that helped. I did not do a 3-ply binding. I just did a single ply for a couple reasons. One, where the loop is, or the circular oval part of the F-hole, I wanted to make that fairly simple to do the binding. A 3-ply binding would have been a nightmare in that area, for me at least. And this process went well. I used a medium viscosity super glue, or CA, and a little bit of tape, and just kind of worked it around, glued a little bit, pressed it in, glued a little bit, pressed it in. With all of the binding glued in place, I did a little bit of cleanup. I'm using acetone on a brush and just washing the CA off the surface and wiping it away about as quickly as I get the surface wet. And it did a really good job. If this was a light color body, it would probably have stained the wood pretty dark and would have been very noticeable. Since this is a dark fumed veneer already, where the super glue did wick into the grain, it's pretty well hidden, better than I originally expected it would be.
Get the new binding, or the replacement binding, put back on. So this is not the factory binding, not the original binding, but the replacement to the anyway, it's got binding on it again. So that went well, actually, overall. I used my router binding contraption